Okay, this lecture is going to be on inflation, and I'm going to have to split this video into multiple parts because it's probably going to take longer than the maximum allotted time. So let's get started. So, again, starting with the foundation, study of choice. We look at economic systems. Those are the environment in which we make choices, and of course, the free market system is the predominant system we see in other economies, and a key component is supply and demand. That's communication. And if we're going to talk about um, an economic system, and if we want to assess how healthy it is, if it's on a sustainable path, we have to define what economic activity is, and that's where GDP comes in. And we looked at what it measures and, of course, what it doesn't measure in terms of uh, activity that it misses and shortcomings regarding using it as a standard of living measurement. And then economic indicators. These are the areas or parts of the economy we can examine to make an assessment of the economy in general. And we're going to be talking about macroeconomic policies. These are things that we could do to influence outcomes like GDP. And the overarching theme is understanding the business cycle, the ups and downs of economic activity. So this inflation is going to fall somewhere in the economic indicators component. So inflation is going to tell us something about the economy, and inflation is going to tell us something about the business cycle. So um, let's get to what inflation is. Basically, anything with a price has an inflation rate, and inflation in general is the change or the increase in the average level of prices. And that's important to realize because sometimes people focus too much on the individual prices. And with inflation, some prices can go up, some prices can go down. We're interested in what's happening to the average. Now, inflation, again, anything with a price level has an inflation rate. So there's asset inflation, price inflation, the stock market, that's a measurement of asset inflation. There is goods and services inflation. That's what we're going to be experiencing or examining. Uh, what is happening to the prices on, on average for goods and services? And some countries have experienced tremendous inflation rates that we call it hyperinflation. And of course, post World War One Germany is one of the best examples, or I don't want to say best, one of the most stark examples of hyperinflation. To get an idea how bad things were in 1923, prices rose in Germany a trillion times over. Now, that's a trillion. That's not a typo. Keep in mind that to be in a hyperinflation economy, inflation has to increase at least 200% per year. This was a trillion times over, much more than the minimum definition of hyperinflation. Now, there have been other countries that have experienced hyperinflation: Russia, Bulgaria. Most recently, Zimbabwe has experienced hyperinflation. They've had an annual inflation rate somewhere in the area of 44 million% per year. Now, in the United States, inflation tends to rise within a range, somewhere between 1 and 4%, with some exceptions like in the 1970s. But that's the basically the range that inflation fluctuates in the United States. And going back to post-World War II Germany, um, just in a 2 month period, May and June in 1923, prices quadrupled. So that's a 300% increase. So how bad did it get in 1923? Well, prices were rising so rapidly, workers had to be paid multiple times a day so they could spend their money before prices went up that evening. That gives you an idea of how bad things were. And uh, in November of 1923, one loaf of bread cost 140 billion marks. And here's an example of how bad things are going. This is what we see is the exchange rate between the um, mark and dollar. So in 1920, a dollar could buy you about 65 marks. Then by 1923, 4 years later, $1 bought you 4.2 trillion marks. So that shows you how much the mark depreciated. And of course, when a country experiences hyperinflation, its currency depreciates against other currencies, which makes sense because as prices rise, it takes more and more money to buy uh, goods and services, and therefore the money supply has to increase. And when you increase the supply of anything, the price or the value tends to go down, and that's what we're experiencing here. So here's some hyperinflation countries. We've seen that here's the inflation rate. Uh, Turkmenistan in 1992, annual inflation rate 429%. Here's Zimbabwe, I talked about. Well, that's a lot. So there's been many examples of modern hyperinflation. And to give you an idea, this board is actually wallpapered with Zimbabwe dollars because money was prices were rising so fast, and the government was printing ever larger denomination of bills. The money became worthless after a while. So inflation itself is not necessarily a bad thing. Inflation is only bad when it's high or volatile. And of course, the words high and volatile are relative. High to me may be low to you. So this has to be taken from a country to country example in terms of what is considered to be high, what is considered to be volatile. In this country, anything above a 4% annual rate in economy-wide inflation is considered to be high. And volatile is anything outside of the range of 1 to 4% annual change. So the average price is determined by the finding the average price of all output. And when the average prices are going up, we call it inflation. But sometimes prices fall. And when prices fall on average, we call that deflation. Now, there is one other term we that is sometimes used in describing changing prices. It's called disinflation. It's not widely used, but it's used enough where it's worthy of note. Now, the confusion comes when people confuse deflation with disinflation. So deflation, they fall in the average price level. Then what does disinflation mean? Um, Take a look at this mock headline. The inflation rate, as measured by CPI, fell to a 2.3 month-to-month annual rate in April from 3.3% in March. Now take a second to read it on your own again, and then answer me the simple question. What happened to the inflation rate during April? Did it go up or down? Did we experience inflation, deflation, or disinflation? Well, we did experience inflation, but the inflation rate was slowing down. So we call a slowing inflation rate disinflation. So um, we're going to be talking more about the prices. We're going to stop right now and we're going to pick this up in part 2.